What's going on, guys? I'm Jody. This is Inspire Woodcraft. I apologize for the camera being all up in my face right this second, but I wanted to get a really good shot of what it is that I want to talk to you guys about today. What we're going to do today, I want to take you through sort of my process for checking a layout tool for square, both inside and outside. I'm not going to bust out any high-tech calibration instruments and everything. I think we can all get sort of caught up in the numbers a little bit too much. The way that I check my tools for square is really no different than I'm sure a lot of people check their tools for square, but it can be a very frustrating task if you don't take a couple of things into consideration, in my opinion. So while we have machinists that like to comment once in a while and talk about how precise and accurate everything is in the machinist world, we don't live in a machinist world. So what I want to know is how accurate is this tool for what I need to use it for? And that's what I want to take a look at today. Now, the first thing that we need to think about is the material that we're going to use to reference this on. This happens to be a piece of maple, but you can use a piece of plywood, anything that is hopefully relatively flat and stable. We also want to take a look at the width of this. Now, to be fair, this is just for video's sake, so this is just a tad narrow. I'm not going to be able to get this little edge down here, but I think you'll be able to figure it out based on what I'm doing. We want this to be able to register the entire length of our blade here. So in this case, I'm going to be okay. It would be better if it was a little bit longer. And then obviously anything shorter, like my double square here, that would be okay too. But if I was going to need to check my combination square, I would need a much wider piece of material. The other thing that we need to think about is this jointed edge. So what that means is that this is as true and flat and straight as we can possibly make it. Now, whether that means you use hand tools or machines, it doesn't really matter as long as we get this as jointed of an edge as possible. Now, it also kind of depends on the tool that we're using, because I have such a long stock here, or handle. I'm going to be able to absorb any minor discrepancies in this face right here. So on a tool like this, if this isn't absolutely pristine, that might be okay. But what about my double square here? It has such a short stock on it that it's really going to pick up on any little variances that's in that face. So again, it's really nice to have that be as close to perfect as we can get it. Now, what I'm going to start off with is a knife. A marking knife is going to give us our most accurate, in my opinion, way of doing this. I'm just going to hold up against this jointed edge just like I normally would. This particular knife is flat on one side and then has double bevels on the other. I'm going to hold this flat up against my blade here. I'm just going to make a nice light pass, and usually that's good enough for me. I'm going to flip this over, and if I can even see where that mark is, I'll explain more about where to place this here in just a second. I'm going to do the same thing, flat up against the tool, and draw a knife. Now, I highly doubt anybody is really going to be able to see this, but what I'm looking for is the distance in between these, both on this end and on this end. Now, the problem with a marking knife is that it's really difficult to see, and I hear from a lot of people all the time that say that they've actually switched from a marking knife to pencil, specifically because as they get older, it's harder and harder to see the knife line. The reason why I don't do it on video is because cameras do not like knife lines at all, and so that's why typically I will use a pencil. Now, I do use my mechanical pencils almost entirely now in the shop, but this is one of the instances where I'm going to say a well-sharpened #2 pencil is going to be your best friend. And what we're going to do is hold the very point of that into the corner here at about, say, 45 degrees, and I'm going to use the same pressure, the same angle, the whole way through like this. I'm just going to set this in here, and when I move, what I'm looking for is a pencil mark that is the same width and both ends as much as I can get it. Then I'm going to flip this over, and I like to slide this not just to the mark, but a little bit over the mark. I want that mark completely out of the way. Then I'm going to do the same thing, same angle, same pressure. And now when I pull that aside, I should have a pretty good indication of what's going on with this tool here. Now, for some, that may be just enough. Now, sometimes what can happen, especially if your pencil isn't absolutely sharp, is that you're going to end up with a false reading, because what's going to happen is you're going to have two pencil lines. One of them is going to be a little bit at the thick, or a little bit thick at the top or the bottom, and the next one is going to be the same or opposite. And what it's going to make it look like is that you're at an angle one way or another. Now, if we're truly at an angle one way or another, that means that our square is off, so long as we do have a nice jointed edge there. When we run our pencil on there, when we pick it up and put it back down, we maybe change where that lead is actually registering. The tip of a pencil lead is usually multifaceted, right? It has a lot of different corners knocked off, especially the larger the pencil lead. When we use a very narrow lead, there isn't as much material to really change the direction, the thickness of our lead, right? And so when we have a nice fine sharp point, we're able to actually just register that little itty bitty bit at the end. But what happens when that lead gets a little bit bigger, like with a mechanical pencil? Now, I do have a 0.3, a 0.4, and a 0.5 here in the shop. And actually, I'll try and see if the 0.5 will show up. Same thing, I can just take this and run a line here, flip it over, run that line over by just a little bit, and run it over. But even with the 0.5, as you can see, these lines down here are really narrow, and they're a bit thicker up here. And you might not think that that makes a big difference, but as I'm looking at it right now, it actually looks like the gap between these two is wider up here than it is down here. I don't know how it's gonna look on camera, but it looks like there's an issue here where my angles are actually in right here. That's not a good thing. So what I can do is simply take my pencil. We'll get some lead out here. I can set it down on a piece of scrap, anything. This just happens to be a piece of plywood. Kind of hold it at a 45 degree here and just run it back and forth. And by running it back and forth, I'm just shaving off until I get a nice fat line here. And what that gives me, you guys probably won't be able to see this, but it gives me a nice knife edge or a chisel edge. It's exactly sheared off to a very, very, very fine point. So let's go right here. We'll do the same thing. Bevel up, moderate pressure, 45 degrees. Now look at that line. That line is much different to my eyeball anyways. Or this line is the same, the top and the bottom the whole way across here. And this will also work for a pencil that maybe isn't absolutely sharp. If I take this over here, just wait until I get a nice thick line there, bevel up, and when I leave, now this one's a little light, but it's the same thickness as it is here. And what's nice is that I can even do this with a carpenter's pencil. This is just a regular carpenter's pencil, which I would usually say don't do this with a carpenter's pencil because their lead is so wide and so thick that it ends up so multifaceted. With a carpenter's pencil, I'll hold it at this, get a nice sharp edge, I'll flip it over. Until I get a knife point on there. Now I can drop this knife point right inside of here, same angle, same pressure, and I have a nice thin line that goes the whole way through. It did end up a little light down here, but at least I can still see it. Now, the issue is this is really difficult to show on camera. We've done this several times now when we talked about high-end and low-end combination squares and how to true up our combination squares and how to check them. We've done it with our high-end, low-end tool series. It's always really difficult to show, especially with camera angles and stuff, how these pencil marks and knife marks really work. But using a system like that where you can just shave off one side to make a nice chisel edge or a knife edge, depending on the type of pencil that you're using, will let you basically have a knife edge without having the knife line, which means you're going to be able to see it a lot better, and you're not going to have nearly the chance for having a wide mark that tapers off to a narrow mark. Now I want to jump over and show you my totally not scientific way to check the outside of our squares as well. Now there's two tools that I seriously recommend everyone should have in their shop. That is a good straight edge, which I have here clamped inside my vise, and then some sort of a square that you can use as a control. This is the square that you're going to hold all your other tools against, and that sets the standard. In my case, it's going to be this. This is the Woodpecker's 6-inch carpenter square. I don't think we've talked about this yet. I think we're gonna talk about the high-end, low-end version in the next video coming up, but this is a tool that I have decided is my control. You can get a machinist square, you can get all kinds of stuff, and I know they make some sets of machinist squares at pretty low prices, but they also make some that are absolute garbage at pretty low prices. Just because something says machinist square does not mean it is the pinnacle and it is guaranteed to be 100% true. Now that being said, you just need to have a square that you're comfortable with in knowing that that is actually at 90 degrees. So what I have here is this square. This is going to be my control. I have it setting on top of, see if you guys can see this at all, my straight edge, which is in my vise. I have this piece of wood behind here, and this is going to help keep these two tools aligned when I go to slide them up against each other. Now, there's a few different things we can do. We all like to try and do the light test. The light test is really good at exposing any kind of variances between the two. The problem is that light also sort of illuminates and makes a small problem look way worse than it actually is. What I want to do is I want to make sure that I have the base and the blade, or the stock and the blade of both tools wiped down, because I don't want any dust or debris in there causing me to see things that aren't really there. This, I'm just sliding up here, kind of like this, just so that they're on the same plane. Because if you get this one askew, especially when you have a square like this that has this notch at the base, what it can do is cause more of a gap than what you may or may not already have. So they're on the same plane. We're just going to drive them up until they touch. Now again, you can use the light test, and this is really good. Hopefully I don't blind you guys. This is really good for exposing any kind of light in here. And I don't know, this is so hard to film, you guys. I don't know if you guys are even able to see this, but the way I'm seeing it is I have barely any light at the bottom, and I have more light at the top. Again, I don't know if that's showing up, but I will tell you this. I've actually already done this once before. Now, this Milwaukee 4.5-inch trim square, this is the one we used the other day, and I told you that it is indeed square. And when I slide it up to this, you did see light come through here. But I want to tell you something. This is the smallest feeler gauge that I have. It is 0.0015. That's 15/10,007 inch, or 0.04 millimeters. That's how thin this is. And I cannot actually slide this in here. I can just barely start it on one edge, but I can't get it all the way through there at all. That means that if I had to guess, and I'm guessing because I don't have a thinner feeler gauge, this is possibly 1/1007 inch difference between this 4.5-inch run. Now the question, of course, that you have to ask yourself is that tolerable to your standards? One thing that can also throw you off, especially on lower end tools, is that this face may not be square this direction. It's really hard to explain, but if I was to put a square on here like this, would that face, the face of the edge of the blade, I know it's really confusing, would that actually be square? Because if that is not actually square, which is very common to not be square when you talk about lower end tools, that's going to give you a kind of weird reading when you do a test like this. And as I hold it up, there's definitely some spots where I am not all the way square. There's some spots where I am, there's some spots where I'm not. So what happens is when you have a square, okay, I'm square this way, and we drop both of these in to the same spot, and we butt them up until they touch, there can be light that shines through there. You can get a feeler gauge onto one side, but not the other, and that's what was happening to me. If I sit here and I could take a look at all kinds of squares. Here's my old Empire square. Slide these two up together. One thing that you can do is sort of stand up, and if you have sort of a white background right here, as you go back and forth, you'll be able to see down in between those pretty easily. Like right now, I can see I'm touching at the top, and I do have a gap at the bottom. I don't even need the flashlight test. And if I hold both of these at the bottom, not squeezing, putting my pressure down here, again, I'm gonna try and get this feeler gauge in here. And I can just barely, okay, at the bottom of this sucks because I don't have a way of doing this so you guys can actually see, but 15 10,000ths, I can get in here at the bottom fairly well and not at the top. So my eyes aren't deceiving me whatsoever. What does that mean? Well, that means that I'm that far off between this distance. This is where I say you have to now figure out whether or not this is something that you can tolerate, or do you think that this is something that is going to throw you off? In most cases, being that much off, you have to ask yourself if you can actually cut that precisely with the tools that you have and the eye that you have and the skill that you have. Now, I just wanted to show you guys that this does indeed work. Real quick, I have this one here. Now this is the Woodpecker's 851. I'm not trying to push any of these tools on you guys, it's just the tools that I have. Okay, I'm gonna make sure the blade and the stock are cleaned off. I'm gonna slide this one up against here, and there's absolutely zero tolerance between the two of those. You can see the flashlight test. I can see like a little tiny something at the top, but it's not even enough really for me to see the light through. I can live with that. And sometimes when we do these practical tests like this, it doesn't really matter what the spec sheet says or how off it is and how many feet or millimeters or whatever it is. It's will it work in our shops? It's something to think about. That's all I got for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I'll see you in the next video.